Should or shouldn't Israel respond in kind to the attack by Iran? Welcome to a temple of thoughts. One of the questions on which the attention of humankind throughout the world is today focused is the question that I raised right at the outset. Should or shouldn't Israel respond as per its well-defined doctrine of defense to the massive attack by Iran on Jewish territory, which is happening for the first time? Now, by way of examining this issue, which is obviously fraught with very serious consequences, let me introduce a particular universal principle which is applicable to every situation involving violence. The problem with violence is that it prevents you from using your own best sense or your well-tested wisdom. Violence generates a logic and a compulsion of its own, which rules out the freedom to remain open to other possibilities. Violence is a demonic principle which demands exclusive loyalty to its own logic. You can't be violent and wise at the same time. Either you're violent or you're wise, and you can't be both. Every instance of violence denotes a failure in social imagination. That's why I've always maintained that resorting to violence is inimical to being human and inimical to human welfare and the peace and stability of the world. Though, for whatever reasons, humankind from the very beginning of our history has more readily reposed its faith in violence than in God. And often, and that's the strangest of all things for me, God has been turned into a footnote to war-making and war-mongering. And the main expectation that people who consider themselves to be devotees of God ascribe to their God is the duty to win wars for them. This is very clear from the history of the Jews. The main expectation of the Jews from very early on was that God, being the greatest of all warriors, will have to win all wars in which the Jews choose to involve themselves. So, God becomes valuable only because He is militarily invincible. Now, the problem is this. Once you as a people internalize this image of God or this idea of God as a God of militaristic invincibility, then you are not free to listen to God in terms of any other mode of wisdom. For example, in the Jewish scripture, in the Psalms, for example, there is this very clear saying which is created by Jews themselves. That's far better to depend on God than depend on horses and chariots. Horses and chariots were the main instruments of war in those days. Today, of course, they are outpaced and rendered anachronistic by massive technological progress in war making. And therefore, when we adapt that statement today, it's far better to depend on God than to rely on the technology of war making or the genius of bloodshed, of shedding blood. But the Jews have renounced, or the Jews did renounce, the freedom to benefit from the wisdom that they themselves created on account of the overwhelming faith the exclusive faith they came to repose in the efficacy of violence. That's the reason why I say that once you put your faith in violence, you disqualify yourself, you render yourself ineligible to benefit from the wisdom that you have yourself acquired through your historical experiences. Now, it's a big subject in itself, but this is not the time for me to go into a full-length analysis of its implications, its scope and application. So I just mark it as a principle that needs to be incorporated into our texture of thinking. The second principle I want to flag in order to think on the subject and arrive at our own conclusion, which may not coincide with the conclusions that are bandied back and forth on the global arena today, is that once a people begin to walk the path of violence, they not only become incapable of benefiting from their own accumulated wisdom, which would have stood them in great stead, they also lose the freedom to decide, and progressively they also lose control over their own situation. To me, this is the most perverse aspect of reposing faith in violence. Violence ultimately turns you into a victim of your own decisions, your own choices, and your own adventures. And it does so by robbing you of the freedom to choose, as well as robbing you of the control you otherwise could have exercised on your situation. Let me explain. Now, to take a very simple example, you are free to climb to the top of your house, roof of the house, and jump from there. Now, jumping from the roof of the house is an act of violence, though in this instance, violence is turned or trained against yourself, but it's violence all the same. I mean, you do so in order to commit suicide. An act of suicide is certainly an act of violence. Now, you are free to climb to the roof, climb on the roof of your house. You're also free to take the decision to jump or not to jump. Up to that point, you are free. But the moment you take the leap, the moment you commit yourself to the path of violence, you lose the freedom to go back, as well as you lose the control over your situation totally. Then what happens to you is that you come under the exclusive authority and control of a force alien to you. In this case, in the case of the illustration I have used, that force is the gravitational pull, which will make you crash to the ground and break your skull, and you die. Now, what happens? I mean, it's universally proved that a person may decide to commit suicide in a fit of passion or the heat of a moment. And he may go and take this decision to leap. But the moment he takes the decision to leap down and die, a contrary pull begins to act on him. Namely, he wants to save himself. But by then it's too late, because he is coming hurtling down, now completely under the pull of the gravitational force. At that time, his control over his situation, as well as his freedom of choice, is nil. How did that happen? How did a human being who otherwise is free to choose an act, choose his destiny, choose to save his life or prolong his life, lose it altogether? Because he reposed his faith in violence and violence alone. These two principles are absolutely essential in understanding the predicament of Israel. I think the greatest tragedy of the Jewish people, they are called people of God, especially elected of God, so on and so forth. I believe all of these claims to be reflective only of the ethnocentric megalomania of a people who simply abuse the name of God in order to sanctify their otherwise unjustifiable, irrational, outlandish claims and rights to special privileges. God is insulted by practically everyone in the world by degrading God into a means of legitimization for one's exclusive rights and privileges, either as individuals or as people groups. And in the case of national religions, God is consistently abused as the legitimization for the collective aggressive ego of the dominant group. And this drama is being acted out in India. And therefore, whatever I am including in this video will have wider national as well as international ramifications. And that's also at the back of my mind in developing these thoughts shared with all of you. So now what is the Jewish predicament? They always reposed their faith in violence and invoked God in order to legitimize the violence that they choose to use. A clear example is from the Bible itself. When the Jews return under the leadership of Moses, who liberated from their bondage in Egypt, and they come back to reclaim their homeland, a repetition of the same pattern. Today's story also happened thousands of years ago. It seems God gave them the instruction to eradicate every person who is not a Jew, every Gentile, from the land that they would inherit or inhabit. Now, do you really believe that God, who cares for all, who has no partiality, who is not partial to any particular race or people or nationality, will give to the Jews the instruction as well as the authority to eliminate other people groups? Certainly, I don't believe so. Not for a moment. And if God indeed said that, I tell you, I will have no respect for such a God. Such a thought is incompatible with my idea of God, the God of compassion, the God of love, the God of truth, the God of justice, the caring, compassionate God, who cares for all, even for the wicked, and who causes his blessings to come upon people, irrespective of their merits. That's God's large-heartedness. That is the secret of God's wisdom and his greatness. But human beings must adapt and adopt God according to their small likes and dislikes and make God an instrument subservient to their partisan interest, and which is, to my mind, the greatest insult we can heap on the unapproachable majesty of God's holiness and sovereign authority. So now, what about the Jews? The Jews today are caught in their own net. I'm not happy to say this, but this is the truth. For example, consider their doctrine of defense. Their doctrine of defense is not only based on the Mosaic law, the law that Moses gave, a tooth for a tooth, an eye for an eye, which Gandhi said would make everyone eyeless and toothless, which is very correct. Gandhiji had an amazing and sanctified common sense that the Jews still lack. They went many steps further. The present doctrine of defense that the Jews have embraced, which they have practiced for the last, say, 70, 75 years, is that someone plucks one tooth, you pluck all their teeth. Disproportionate and overwhelming reaction. In other words, the cultification of violence, and violence to be administered in disproportionate terms in order to intimidate and overwhelm, to strike awe and fear, shock and awe, to use the familiar American phrase, shock and awe to the adversary. Now, the Jews are caught, the Jewish state, the authorities of the Jewish state, the war council is today caught in this trap of their own making. There was a time the Jews could have held on to their doctrine, but the global scenario is changing and changing very fast. That their doctrine is no longer feasible. And if at all they want to prove that it's feasible, they'll have to risk their very existence as a separate race. I'm afraid that if the Jews don't handle the present situation wisely and with circumspection and historical wisdom, they will be wiped out. Hitler failed in his proclaimed intention to wipe out Jews from the face of the earth. But the Jews will succeed in wiping themselves out of existence if they don't handle the present situation wisely. That's my concern. It's a very serious concern. No partisan interest will make me keep quiet about it. I know I'll be despised by many of my fellow Christians for saying this, but I have to tell you the truth. If I love the Jewish people, I would wish wisdom on them and not foolishness based on their cultification of violence. So they're trapped in this doctrine of defense, which is predicated entirely on violence. Defense, offense is a defense. It is not sustainable. Now, because of their doctrine of defense, the leaders of the Jewish state, particularly members of the War Council, now feel obliged to retaliate in kind. Not just in kind, but retaliate disproportionately. Now, if you look at the Iranian action, which was taken in response to the Jewish or Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Syria, Damascus, and therefore there is some justification, if you like, though the Iranian action is disproportionate. But to their credit, it must be noted, they did it most discreetly. They notified their actions 72 hours in advance. They notified America, knowing very well that if Americans are notified, Israel also will be notified. They also notified all the countries in the region. They also notified international aviation so that commercial planes are not caught in this dangerous situation. So they did it in such a manner as to indicate their decision, their choice, deliberate choice to minimize human casualties. Though 9 or 10 ballistic missiles landed in Israel, they were targeted to make minimal loss. I have no doubt at all that if the Iranian think tank and the military brass wanted to cause maximum damage to Israel, they could have unleashed the kind of aerial barrage that would have easily overwhelmed the Iron Dome and the other two layers of aerial defense that Israel are, including David Sling and Arrow, and etc. They are sophisticated. They are marvels of technology, but they can be overwhelmed. And that's something that, in a very mild way, in a very wise way, Iran has proved. And I'm quite amazed. I'm very impressed by the very calibrated response on the part of Iran. And they have also reinforced it by saying that on our part, action is now concluded. We have no intention to proceed further with it. Let's treat it a closed chapter. It is quits. You have hit us, we have hit you. Let's call it quits. And there is some sense in it, though I would have been happier if the Iranian response weren't as massive as it turned out to be. However, let that be. Now, it is this kind of situation that Israel has to handle. Now, there are, of course, warmongers among the Jews, and in the War Council itself, the ultra-Orthodox political faction is baying for blood. They want to teach Iran a lesson, so on and so forth. They're doing so not because they're convinced that that particular option would be in their best interest. They're doing so because they have no freedom to say anything else, because they are trapped in their own image. They are held hostage by their own image as ultra-Orthodox people who have to believe in violence. Whether or not they believe in God or Yahweh is optional. But if you're an ultra-Orthodox Jew, then you have to believe in the legitimacy of violence against Palestinians and Arabs in general. That's the tragedy of it. That's a tragedy to which human beings are rendered disposed or oriented by religion, irrational religion. Now, if Israel takes that path, my dear friends, let me put it very mildly, the consequences are unforeseeable. I really don't believe that no matter how powerful Israel is militarily, no matter how adequate Israeli nuclear warheads are to burn to ashes Iran a few times over, Israel as a state will not exist thereafter. At any rate, nuclear war is not an option. An atom bomb is only a military ornament, and no ornament has any practical use. You cannot use an atom bomb and survive thereafter. That's the doctrine of MAD. MAD means mutually assured destruction. In a nuclear war, there will be no winners. There will be no survivors. And it's not difficult for Iran, as I said in my previous message, to acquire one or two nuclear warheads, even if they are not in a position to produce these warheads themselves. And I don't believe they are far away from it. There could be a few weeks, a month, a few months away from producing these warheads themselves because of the stupid decision on the part of Donald Trump to pull out of this nuclear non-proliferation treaty, nuclear regulation agreement with Iran. They can easily buy a few warheads from North Korea, and that country is forever willing to part with whatever weapons of mass destruction it has for ample material considerations. Pay an ample price and you get it. It's not at all difficult. It's a matter of few hours, really. So, I think the best option for Israel, and that's really my conviction, and I might as well share this with you. The best option for Israel is actually the one suggested by Joe Biden. I'm not Joe Biden's admirer. I believe it's time for him to retire from politics and enjoy a mellowed old age at home. To me, he is near geriatric. He is not in a position to guide America, especially through these difficult days. However, that's another issue. I'm not saying this is an admirer of Joe Biden, but I fully endorse the wisdom of his words in this context, to the extent that the damage inflicted by Iran on Israel is minimal, and it was intended to be so. Consider it quits. Do not push it any further over the edge, over the precipice, because then God alone knows what will happen. But the question is, if the Jewish leadership would be free to benefit from this advice. Now, I want to add to the wisdom of Biden, though I'm nobody to do so, except that I have meditated on life and its realities to an extent. I would say that sometimes real strength is exemplified or is proved or showed not in unleashing violence, but in choosing to withhold the use of violence. That's also a strength. And that is a message that Mahatma Gandhi gave to the whole world, a message, the root of which lies deeply buried in the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. Now, when Jesus was tried before Pontius Pilate, anyone would have expected him to become so voluble. I mean, he could have overwhelmed the intellect of Pontius Pilate, the Jewish judge, the Roman judge, procurator. What did he do? He kept silent. He didn't utter a word. That silence shook Pontius Pilate. That silence was 1,000 times more powerful than 1,000,000 words that Jesus could have uttered. There is a time to speak and there is a time to be silent. There is a time perhaps to resort to armed resistance. There is a time to withhold the use of violence. And I have no doubt at all that as regards the Jews, the time to abjure total faith in violence is now. It's here. This is the moment. And to move on to a higher moral pedestal and say that in the interest of world peace and in deference to the wishes expressed by the well-meaning people of the world, the various allies, this Iranian attack has effected a very positive change in the climate of opinion concerning Israel. The global goodwill that they squandered by unleashing violence on the people of Gaza is more than compensated now. Israel is reinstated in the zone of goodwill as far as the global community is concerned. It is too precious a prize to be squandered. So, in view of all this, we decide not to retaliate. And we are aware that in doing so, we are going against the prescriptions of our own doctrine of defense. But today, we are in a position to do so because we are powerful. The fact of the matter, my dear friends, and I am addressing this particularly to the youth of the world, sometimes a far greater strength and far more sensible strength, the strength that would help you long term, is not the strength to resort to physical violence, but the decision to bank on the power of the soul, the power of being inspiredly human, or human in an inspired sense. That's the power of Jesus Christ. That's the power of one Lord Buddha. That's the power of Mahatma Gandhi. That's the power of Mother Teresa. That's the power of all those who believed in God and therefore renounced violence. The world needs such leadership. Would the Jews at this point in time be wise enough and spiritually enlightened enough to measure up to that historical exigency requirement? I don't know. Unfortunately, because the Jews have developed themselves along the lines of science, technology, and materialistic progress, and also because today Israel is considered a modern miracle in terms of economic development and scientific technological progress. For example, it's one of the 4 leading nations in artificial intelligence and is using part of its artificial intelligence resource or know-how in the war in Gaza. Israel has become almost incapable of reposing any trust in the power of the Spirit. India is a country where the freedom of the people was purchased not with the power of weapons, as Subhash Chandra Bose thought he would be able to. Our freedom was bought with the power, in the words of Gandhi, of character and soul force, which was ahimsa, or the informed, enlightened decision to abjure the path of violence, to stick to the path of truth and respect for life. What has happened in Gaza the last 6 months is a complete desecration of life. One can advance many excuses, many reasons why that is justified and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, in my mind, human bloodshed, no matter where it happens, is an act of pollution. As I said in one of my previous videos, the hypocrisy that man-centered world has always created is shedding human blood in the name of war is considered sacred. It's considered an act of piety to the nation, and people are honored for doing so. But the blood that a woman sheds as part of her monthly cycle, which denotes life, whereas the previous instance denotes death, that's considered polluted, ugly, impure, sacredly or ritualistically impure. It should be the other way around. Bloodshed in war and regional skirmishes must be considered impure, polluting, unclean, and its perpetrators labeled enemies of humanity, warmongers and war strategists, and those who fatten themselves on human blood, the international arms mafia, military-industrial complex. They are obscene. They are a shame on humanity. But they are the ones who are universally respected and glorified and sung about. So this hypocrisy, we have to confront all of this. At any rate, the main challenge that confronts me today, or the main lesson that history is posing before me, is that violence is no longer sustainable as a strategy for life. Faith in violence is incompatible with commitment to life. Violence equals death. Non-violence or love for truth, respect for life equals life. And commitment to life rather than commitment to death betokens godliness. And that's why the psalmist says, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. If you fear God, you will abjure violence. And when you do not place your faith in violence, then you'll have to put your faith in the wisdom of God. Either violence or wisdom, you can't have both, as I said right at the outset. So what do I counsel the Jews to do, the Israeli authorities to do? Withhold. Do not unleash. See if you can assume the responsibility for creating a better environment in that region. After all, things were shaping well, weren't they? The Abrahamic Accords, the prospect of normalization of relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia, of all Arab countries, and other countries in this region. And something of the remnant of that foundation still remains. It can be reclaimed. Take the path of peace, of coexistence, of progressing together, of brotherhood, which is right at the heart of the Jewish vision of life. And this idea of, instruments of bloodshed saving you has been your curse from the beginning of your history. That's the reason why for 2,000 years you were strangers and restless people wandering the face of the earth without a homeland. You cannot have a homeland if you continue to believe in violence and violence alone. You cannot have a home, much less a homeland. That's a message, and there can be no alternative to that message in history. Any belief to the contrary is suicide, a deadly delusion. Do not walk this path. Do not walk this path. Thank you.